So one of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to, and I didn't. I was a little boy, so I didn't understand why. But as I got older, I realised we had addiction in my family. Actually, several members of my family had addiction problems, and like a lot of people who grow up in families where there's addiction problems, I was also drawn to people. So I had other people in my life who had addiction problems. And one of the reasons I wrote my book Chasing the Scream is that I wanted to understand what really causes addiction and what genuinely can be done to deal with it. And I wanted to go to the places where they adopted all sorts of different approaches. I was always sympathetic to compassionate approaches, but I wanted to see for myself, so I went to places where they had super harsh approaches. I went out in Arizona with a group of women who were made to go out on a chain gang, wearing t-shirts saying I was a drug addict and made to dig graves while members of the public mock them. I went to Vietnam where they literally put drug users in gulags. And I went to places where they'd adopted really compassionate approaches. Switzerland has legalised heroin for addicts. Portugal has decriminalised all drugs. I wanted to see the difference between the results. But I think the thing I learned that most surprised me, there were plenty of things that I learned about that I already knew, but the thing that really blew my mind is that addiction is really not what we think it is, and the causes of addiction are really not what we think they are. So if you had said to me, nearly 5 years since I started working on the book, if you'd said to me, what causes, say, heroin addiction, I would have looked at you like you were a simpleton. I would have said, well, it's called heroin addiction, the clue's in the name, right? We've been told this story about addiction for the last 100 years that's become part of our common sense. It was definitely part of my common sense. In fact, I literally thought I had seen it in front of my eyes. So we think that if you and me and the next 20 people to walk past my flat, if we just grabbed them off the street and made them use heroin for a month, at the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts. We'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason, that there are chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to physically need. They'd have this desperate craving for it. And by the end of that month, they'd all be desperate for it. And that's what addiction is, that craving for the chemical hook. And the first thing that alerted me to the fact there's something not right about that story is when several doctors I interviewed, including Gabor Mate, wonderful doctor, explained to me, if you step out onto the street after we have this conversation and you get hit by a truck, God forbid, and you break your hip, you'll be taken to hospital. It's quite likely you'll be given loads of diamorphine for the pain. Diamorphine is heroin. It's just a medical name for heroin. It's much better heroin than you'd score up the road in the estate round the corner from here, because what you buy there is going to be very little of it is going to actually be heroin. It's going to be mostly contaminants, whereas what doctors give you is the pure stuff. Now, people are given that in hospital the whole time for really quite long periods. My grandmother had a hip replacement operation. Anyone watching this, if your nan had a hip replacement operation, she took lots of heroin. Now, if what we think about addiction is right, that it's primarily caused by the chemical hooks, what should happen to all these people being given heroin in hospital for protracted periods of time? Some of them at least should become heroin addicts. This has been studied very carefully. It doesn't happen. And when I learned that, it seemed so weird and so contrary to everything I'd ever been told that I didn't really believe it at first. And I only really began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and spent time with an incredible man there called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor of psychology. And Bruce explained to me that the idea about addiction we've got in our heads, that it's caused by the chemical hooks, comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. Really straightforward experiments. openDemocracy's readers can do them at home if they're feeling a bit sadistic this week. You get a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself. So there you go, right? That's totally fits with our understanding of addiction. But in the 70s, Professor Alexander came along and said, well, hang on a minute. In these experiments, we put the rat alone in a cage with nothing to do except use these drugs. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically like paradise for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of coloured balls, they've got loads of tunnels, they've got loads of friends, they can have sex all the time, anything a rat can want in life, right? It's got there in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water, and the drugged water. And obviously the rats try both because they don't know what's in them. But this is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. So you go from almost 100% compulsive use and overdose when their lives are shit to none when their lives are good. Now, there's lots of human examples that I can talk about, but I think this tells you, and I think illustrates the principle even more powerfully, but I think it tells you something really fundamental about addiction. That addiction is not driven by exposure to the chemicals. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety, the opposite of addiction is connection, to meaning, to purpose, to social units, to a decent life. And you know, it kind of puzzled me to, when I first learned about that, it took me a long time to get my head around it. And one of the ways that I think really helped me to understand it is to think about, you know, totally legally, we could both have vodka now, right? We could be drinking that now, right? We're not. The reason we're not is not because anyone's stopping us, right? We could get drunk for the next week and we would, you know, I'd still have my flat, we'd still be alive. The reason we're not doing it is because we don't want to, because we want to be present in our lives, because we've got jobs we love, we've got people we love, we've got things we want to do. The core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life, because your life is a very difficult place to be. Once you understand that, you understand why the war on drugs is failing so badly. Because the war on drugs is premised upon the idea, or a large part of the war on drugs is premised on the idea that what we have to do with addicts is make them suffer more in order to make them stop. In fact, if suffering and pain are the reason they're turning compulsively to their drug use, more suffering and more pain doesn't just not work, it's worse than that, it actually makes the problem worse. And you see that evidence everywhere you go. I think Hari Anslinger is probably the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. He's a symbol of his time as much as he is the creator of his time, and you don't want to overstate it. I'm not a believer in the great man theory of history by any means, but I do think that Hari Anslinger's life tells us something really fundamental about what the war on drugs was about at the start and what it's about now. So Hari Anslinger takes over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition is ending in the late 20s. And he's a government bureaucrat. He's actually got his position because his wife is married to one of the richest men in America, who happens to be the Treasury Secretary. And this is part of the Department of Prohibition was part of the Treasury Department. And Hari Anslinger inherits this really demotivated department that's really corrupt and has just failed in the war on alcohol completely, famously and catastrophically. And he wants to keep his department going beyond alcohol prohibition. And he's basically given responsibility for dealing with heroin and cocaine. But heroin and cocaine trades are really quite small in the United States at the time. They certainly wouldn't justify a government department that size. And Hari Anslinger decides to create effectively the modern war on drugs. He's the first person to use the phrase warfare against drugs, which I discovered when I went and spent some time in his archives. And he was extremely clever at thinking about how you manipulate American public opinion. And he decided, if you want to have a popular war in the United States, you've got to build it around things that people hate. And he built it around two things he really hated. One was drug addicts. He had a really deep hatred of addiction based on some bad childhood experiences, which is partly where the title of my book, Chasing the Scream, comes from. But also African Americans and Chinese Americans. This was the other group he really despised. It's important to understand, he was regarded as a crazy racist in the 1920s. This is how racist Hari Anslinger was. He used the N-word so often in official police memos. His own senator said he should have to resign from his position. That's how much he was driven by race. And he really built, he really constructed a story with the help of Hearst newspapers, which was the kind of Fox News of the day, that drugs were this thing that takes people over, and they were being spread by African Americans and Chinese Americans who were destroying the fabric of American society, polluting America. And in the book I tell the story of, I think it symbolizes so much, the story of what he did to Billie Holiday, because I think it shows us something about the core of the war on drugs. So 1939, Billie Holiday stood on stage in Midtown Manhattan, And she sang a song that most people watching this will know, Strange Fruit. An extraordinary song against lynching. It has this image of African-American men's bodies hanging from the tree being the strange fruit of the South. And her goddaughter Lorraine Feather said to me, you've got to understand how shocking this was to people. This was a time when there were virtually no popular songs that were political, and when African-American women were supposed to be, subordinate. Billie Holiday wasn't even allowed to walk through the front door of the hotel where she performed that song. She had to go through the service elevator because she was African-American. And that night she gets a warning from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics that basically says, stop singing this song. And it's where I open the book, and to some people it might seem like a weird place to open a book about the war on drugs, because you think, well, what's that got to do with the war on drugs? It has everything to do with the war on drugs. Anslinger saw Billie Holiday as the symbol of everything that was going wrong with America. She was an African-American woman resisting white supremacy, and because she had been horrifically raped when she was a child, she had been forcibly prostituted as a child in really unbearable circumstances. She had a heroin and alcohol problem. She was trying to stun her grief from her childhood. And Billie Holiday basically said, when she gets this warning from the FBN, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, fuck you, I'm an American citizen, I'll do what I want. And that's the point at which they resolved to destroy her. And I tell the full story in the book of what they did to her. It's something that's happened to hundreds of thousands of addicts all over the world since. First of all, he sends, it's kind of heartbreaking, he hated employing African Americans, but you couldn't really send a white guy into Harlem to stalk Billie Holiday, it'd be kind of obvious. So he employs this guy called Jimmy Fletcher, and Jimmy Fletcher follows Billie Holiday around for 2 years. Billie Holiday was so amazing, he fell in love with her, and his whole life he felt really ashamed of how he busted her. She's sent to prison. In prison she doesn't sing a word, but the worst thing is what happens next. It's something that we do now, today. So she gets out of prison, and at that time, to perform anywhere where alcohol was served, you needed a cabaret performer's license, it was called. Anslinger makes sure she doesn't get a cabaret performer's license. So one of her friends, Yolanda Bavan, who's herself an amazing jazz singer, said to me, what's the cruelest thing you can do to someone? Is to take away the thing they love. They take away singing from Billie Holiday. We give addicts criminal records in Britain, all over, in most parts of the world. They can't get back to work. They can't get back to a normal life. We put barriers between them and a normal life. Billie Holiday, of course, relapses into heroin addiction. Eventually she collapses. She's 44 years old. She had very bad liver cancer because of her very heavy alcohol use. She's taken to hospital. First hospital won't even take her because she's a drug addict. Second hospital, she's convinced the Federal Bureau of Narcotics people are still going to come for her. She says to one of her friends, Maylie Dufty, they're going to kill me in there. Don't let them, they're going to kill me in there. She was kind of right. She's taken into the hospital. She's diagnosed with liver cancer. She goes into heroin withdrawal. One of her friends, Maylie, manages to insist that she's given methadone, and she starts to recover a bit. They come in, Anslinger's men come in, they arrest her on her hospital bed, they handcuff her to the hospital bed, they take away her candies, her flowers, they don't let her friends in to see her. And then they cut off her methadone, and she dies, I think, the next day or a couple of days later. One of her friends said to the BBC that she looked like she had been violently wrenched from life. That story tells you a lot. I then obviously spent a lot of time around the world looking at different places, and you absolutely see how race is an overwhelming factor today. 1 in 3 African-American men between the ages of 18 and 30 in Washington, DC are in prison on probation or parole at any given time. I mean, I spent time in Anacostia in DC, one of the poorest African-American neighborhoods. I mean, the degree of the racism is insane. African-Americans are no more likely to buy or sell drugs than any other ethnic group, but they make up the overwhelming majority of people who go to prison for it. And in case British people watching this are feeling a bit kind of superior, there is one country in the world that has a worse racial disparity in drug arrests than the United States, and it's us. And it's worth bearing in mind, the United States is significantly worse than apartheid South Africa at the height of apartheid was in its racial disparity on drug arrests. So we've got a terrible problem here in Britain with this, and I think it's something we really need to discuss. So the war on drugs all along, there were many components to it. Some people argue that this is the only thing that it's about, and I don't think they're right. But a very significant component of the war on drugs right from the start was a pretext to persecute and punish hated groups. And even when people are not consciously racist, for example, one of the central figures in my book, an extraordinary former cop in Baltimore called Lee Maddox, who underwent this incredible journey when it comes to the war on drugs, explained to me, even when it's not consciously racist, Lee Maddox is not a racist. Lee had actually risked her life to go undercover to expose the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. Even when it's not consciously racist, if you have a law which is broken by almost half the population, obviously we can't put half the population in prison, right? Who is going to be punished? It's going to be the easiest people to punish, the most disliked groups, the most discriminated against groups. One of her colleagues, Matthew Fogg, said, not to me, in a public interview, I think a public speech, sorry, he was a leading cop in DC, and one day he went to his boss and said something like, "Hey boss, how come when we do drug busts, we only ever go to the African American neighbourhoods? I'm pretty sure white people use drugs, why don't we go to those neighbourhoods?" And his boss said something like, "Well, you know, Fogg, you're right, but those people get lawyers and they know judges and journalists and they make a fuss, just go for the low-hanging fruit." So even when the intent isn't racist, the effect is very often racist. So we're about to come to this absolutely crucial moment in global drug policy. It's worth just explaining to people why this is happening. So once every 10 years, the war on drugs has, the United Nations has a kind of drugs jamboree where all the countries of the world come to New York, they meet in a special session at the UN, and they pledge to rid the world of drugs and, enforce the drug war even more and have prohibition and crack down and all of that. It's happening 2 years early because this year the governments of Mexico, Colombia and Guatemala asked for it to happen early because they're in such crisis. And what's fascinating is this is going to be the first time that loads of countries turn up and say, we're not doing this shit anymore. It doesn't work, it's been a catastrophe. The world has to follow the alternatives that are working so well in the countries that have tried them. So in the last month or so, maybe a little bit more, I've been speaking to some of the politicians who are going to be there and making dissident, speaking out. So, and it's a really interesting mix of countries. So, I just saw in Colombia some people who were involved in the planning for the UNGASS. Mauricio Rodriguez, who was actually our ambassador, the Colombian ambassador here to Britain for a while, explaining this. Colombia has been destroyed by the war on drugs. It's worth remembering more people have died in drug war violence in Mexico and Colombia that have died in the war in Syria, right? You compare how much we talk about Syria, quite rightly as we should, to how we virtually never talk about the drug war violence, and that violence we could end if we wanted to. Jindřich Voboril, who's the drugs minister for the Czech Republic, super interesting guy. He was himself had a drug problem. He actually grew up basically on the streets under the communist tyranny. Lots of his friends died of drug-related problems. He's a great advocate for addicts, for saving the lives of addicts, for pointing out that the system of prohibition causes an enormous death toll among addicts all over the world. Another example is Mark Golding, amazing Justice Minister for Jamaica, who I spoke to recently, who talks about, which is a kind of parallel with the United States. He was particularly moved. There was a case of a guy a couple of years ago who was picked up for smoking a spliff by the police and beaten to death in prison. And Mark talked about, how the war on drugs licenses attacks on minorities. Obviously, we've been talking a lot recently about the Black Lives Matter campaign, and clearly race is a really significant factor. But even in a country like Jamaica, which is obviously almost entirely non-white, it licenses the police to just attack the poor and attack the disliked groups in that society, and that's one reason why he actually argues for full legalisation. So it's going to be fascinating to see this range of countries speaking out at the UN and saying enough with this. It'd be interesting to see the role of other countries. So we know that there's going to be a block of extreme prohibitionist countries, Iran, God, it's such a terrible list. China, Russia, the Saudis. So you've got that bloc who are going to argue for an even more extreme war on drugs, some of whom are actually still executing people for being involved with drugs. Be interesting to see where Britain and the US stand on this. So I remember at the World Federation Against Drugs conference a few years back, seeing the British representative literally standing with Viktor Ivanov, the Russian drug czar, who was one of the most depraved and wicked people he was causing the deaths of thousands of Russians with their drug policies, the most extreme drug policies you can imagine. Britain literally lining up with him to demand a harsher drug war. Interesting to see with the US. The US is up to now, as we know from Anslinger, has been one of the key figures imposing the drug war on the world. There's a great quote from Harry Anslinger at one of the, would it have been the League of Nations? No, it was by that time, it was the UN, an early UN meeting about drugs. A representative of one country disagreeing with him, and Harry Anslinger said, "I've made up my mind, don't try to confuse me with the facts," which I always thought should be like the perfect motto for the global war on drugs. But what you've had is the US imposing that on countries really through economic threats and literal war, in some cases, the actual violence. The US is in a strange position now. The US is turning up itself in breach of the UN drug conventions because there's been this rebellion by wonderful ordinary American citizens. 4 states have now voted to fully legalize marijuana. More are going to do it in November. 3 of them already have legal marijuana stores in place with really excellent results. So the US is not in a position to stand up and go, "Listen, you fuckers, do what we tell you," because they are themselves in breach of it. So that'll be a fascinating moment as well. But I think the most crucial thing about the UNGASS is, so all the reform countries are asking for is, we're going to have another UNGASS in 2 years about drugs. What we should do is set up a panel of experts to go away, look at the best evidence and come back and make recommendations that would achieve the goals we all agree on. We all want less addiction. We all want teenagers to be protected from drug use. We all want less violence around the drug trade. Now, I actually think that probably won't happen, but because I just think the resistance is going to be too big, and they literally, like Harry Anslinger, they don't want to look at the evidence. They're actually afraid of looking at the evidence. Same reason the British government keeps refusing to set up a panel to look into the science of this. But what I think you will have, in fact, another Colombian whose name I'm blanking on said this to me. One of the guys who's involved in preparing Colombia's position at the UNGASS said to me, "No one will be able to say after this that the world is unanimous, we all agree, we all want a drug-free world." That's ridiculous. Actually, that no one can say that anymore. That moment will have passed. And for there to be no consensus is itself a victory. So like all societies, the US is highly complex and has many different forces and many different sources of power. And what you've seen over the last few years is a really extraordinary and inspiring rebellion by ordinary American citizens against a failed policy by their government. So you've got this big government bureaucracy that is committed to the war on drugs and profits directly from the war on drugs. If you want to know who that kind of military-industrial complex surrounding the drug war are, it's quite a simple way to find out, which is to look at who funds the no campaigns whenever marijuana legalization is on the ballot. Generally, it's the private prison industry. No one needs me to explain how they profit from that. The prison guard unions, and this actually is a difficult thing to say, that I actually think the private prisons, the private element has been, I'm against private prisons, but the private element has been slightly overstated because actually the public prisons have the prison guard unions who back the drug war just as much. The alcohol companies, they're big backers of no because they don't want a competitor. They rather you got drunk on a Saturday night than got stoned on a Saturday night. Evangelical Christian groups, who obviously have a kind of ideological commitment, the Mormons are a good example, have a kind of ideological commitment to opposing those things. So you've got those forces. You've got public opinion, which is very strongly aware that the war on drugs has failed. It's something like 80% say that the war on drugs has failed, but is very sceptical about alternatives and very nervous about alternatives. I think not unreasonably, and that's partly because the alternatives haven't been explained to people very well. And they haven't explained what happened in Portugal, they haven't explained what happened in Switzerland. And then you've got the shift of public opinion towards liberalisation and a regulated drug trade, which is really kind of remarkable. When Bill Clinton left office, 15% of Americans were in favour of legalising marijuana. If Hillary Clinton becomes president this November, which is elected president, becomes president next January, which looks quite likely, I think, around 50% of people, probably slightly more by then, because it's going up every month, will be in favour of legalising marijuana. That is a huge change in a really short period of time, right? So when people say about politics of drug reform, it's impossible, we can't do it, I would just say to people, look at the shifts that are happening all over the world. Switzerland is a super conservative country. I'm a citizen there because my dad's from there, although obviously I'm a citizen here as well. My grandmother got the vote in 1973, right? Switzerland is not San Francisco. And yet the Swiss voted by 70%. 70% of Swiss people voted to keep heroin legal once they'd seen it in practice. So I think you're seeing an enormous shift in public opinion in a really short period of time. And whenever I talk to people or whenever I get depressed about this and you think, oh, this is such a big fight, and every year we wait, more and more people die. What I say to people is, I try to imagine, so 1969, right, the Stonewall riots happen. You've had 2,000 years of gay people being persecuted. 1969, the day those riots begin, a bunch of drag queens kick off because they're just sick of it and they say, you're not going to do this to us anymore. When that happened, the pro-gay position in New York City, the most liberal part of the United States, was to say, okay, gay people may not be evil, they're sick. And most people didn't hold the pro-gay position, right? When I get depressed, I try to imagine standing outside the Stonewall Inn with those people that night and saying to them, okay, you're not going to believe me, but 43 years from now, a president of the United States in his second inaugural address is going to name this as one of the greatest moments in American history. And it will get the biggest cheer of everything he says that day. And he's going to be black. A lot of those people, a lot of those drag queens that night, they lived to see that happen. So extraordinary changes can happen very quickly. We've learned that. And I think particularly when the evidence is so strong that the alternatives work everywhere where they're being tried.